This prism may just be calculating. For those of you who have yet to figure out women, or why people do the things they do, it turns out it might be as simple as 1 plus 1. There is a simple mathematical formula that can be used to explain everything from child-parent struggles to cyber attacks and civil unrest. Well, okay, it's probably not as simple as 1 plus 1, but for a look inside something called power law and the mathematics of conflict, we're being joined by Dr. Neil Johnson. He's a professor of physics and the head of the interdisciplinary research group in complexity at the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Miami. Welcome, Dr. Johnson.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So what we're really looking at here is patterns of behavior and then breaking them down into mathematical equations?
Yes, we were particularly interested in how humans interact. I mean, often when we think about interactions, particularly when they're kind of conflicts situations, they sound so random and there's no sense in anything that's going on. It's just a lot of randomness. And so we set out to ask the question, well, is it really random? Are human interactions random, or is there some kind of rhyme and reason, some kind of pattern behind them? And so we decided to look at the numbers behind human interactions.
So in the way that people look at chaos theory and meteorological events, you decided to look at the randomness within human interactions, whether it's a baby crying at a parent or something happening between groups of people, and seeing if there were similarities, correlations, associations.
Yes, and we're particularly interested in, and I know this from my own kids, that somehow arguments can kind of run away from you. You're involved in an argument with a child. And yet it escalates in a way that it's not. You're not really sure. You're not in control of it. You're not really sure that that your child or the other party is in control of it. So somehow it kind of takes on a life of its own. So we really wanted to understand if this idea of escalating conflicts. I mean, we use that term to describe a conflict on a personal level, but we also use that term to describe, well, global conflicts and even cyber attacks and we think about the future of possible cyber warfare. Are there kind of patterns in the way that two sides play out these kind of confrontations?
And this is something that's been understood at least to a degree. I remember my very first job, I was teaching art in a psychiatric ward. And within that frame, the social workers, the psychiatrists were talking to me about what they called the crisis cycle, and how if you get into a place where one of the patients begins to get emotional, you need to remain flat. Because if you respond with emotion, if you do other things, they very well may ratchet it up, and you don't want to go to the level they want to ratchet it up to.
That's exactly right. And so you have a very similar situation, of course, say with civil unrest. There are many cases in the world now of, people are kind of asking questions. There's some civil unrest, pockets of civil unrest developing. Is this going to escalate? And what should the other side do? And what is the effect when the other side either does nothing, sits flat, as you suggest, or somehow begins to respond? And what we found is there's almost like a kind of language in the numbers that kind of dictates the conversation between these two sides as it begins to, as it either escalates or in some cases, I'm glad to say, de-escalates. And we found a kind of common pattern then relating all these cases, even though some of them, they had nothing to do with each other. A baby and a parent has very little to do with, say, protests in Poland or, attacks in the jungle in Colombia. And yet we found in the numbers were telling us that, yes, they are related in how they play out.
In the paper, the mathematical formula is described as simple. Now, simple, of course, is in the eye of the beholder. Can you describe the equation? Can you describe how many variables you're including in the construction of this equation?
Well, I have to sit back and say that, I'm used to dealing, I mean, I'm like the world of physicists are used to dealing with equations that unfortunately don't have, have many variables in them. But
Hmm.
surprisingly, we found even though we're talking about humans here and we're not even talking about one human's behavior, we're talking about something that involved two parties that neither are controlling. We could describe the pattern of the escalation of events as 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 an equation that only involved three variables.
Really?
It was ABC, literally ABC. It's the ABC of interactions, and it was the formula is actually that it's A times B to the power of minus C, where if we're talking about the timing of events, the A, B, and C mean a specific thing, and if we're talking about the severity of events, the A, B, and C mean a specific thing.
Now, are the A, B, and C's always different A, B, and C's, or are they relatively constant, fixed variables, so to speak?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we went into this. First of all, we didn't expect an A. We thought it would be A, B, C, D, E, F, G, etc. And we certainly didn't expect any kind of relationship between these numbers. But what we found is quite remarkable. First of all, we found that events in conflict situations, the severity of the event and the timing of the event decouple. They're not correlated, which was a surprise and actually quite useful to us because it meant we could deal with severity and the timing of events separately. So let me turn first to the severity. What we found, irrespective of whether we're talking about FARC guerrillas operating in Colombia or we're talking about anti-government activity, violent activity in across Africa, or Afghanistan, etc., etc., etc. Didn't matter where the geography or the reason behind the conflict. We found that the severity of events fell on a distribution that had a value, it was this AB to the minus C, but where this C value, it has a magic number. The magic number isn't 3, the magic number is actually 2.5. And this held, as I said, irrespective of whether we were looking, which continent we're looking at, whether we're looking inside a country in a continent, whether we're looking in particular departments within a country. And so it's like a kind of natural law of how the severities in an ongoing conflict between two sides will sit. And this is a very unusual outcome because if we talk about, say, heights in a room, we're all sort of used to the fact that most people are, well, the average maybe around 5'9", and then there's somebody maybe 5 foot, maybe somebody up to 7 foot, maybe, but there isn't someone of 20 feet. We don't we build buildings knowing that nobody will walk through nobody will try to get in who's 20 feet tall. But that's not what you find with the severity of events in conflict. This power law is a very special type of distribution. It means that you can have the 20-foot person arriving quite often. In fact, it's like looking out and suddenly seeing people as tall as buildings and even higher on a reasonably regular basis. That's what happens with the severity of attacks in conflicts. And as I said, irrespective of what the conflict is, they all have the same distribution. It's the so-called slope of the distribution, but its value is 2.5, and this is quite remarkable.
Now, I want to throw in a bit of a cynical question. In my youth, in my high school youth, someone bought me for a gift once upon a time a deck of tarot cards. And I got into doing the tarot cards and doing readings. And I actually stopped after a few months because almost all of my readings were correct. Now, that seemed to me to be very odd, and it made me nervous as a very young person. Looking back, I also realized that all of my readings were also a little bit generic. They were a little bit broad. And so the possibility that they were going to be correct improved vastly. Now, in terms of your outcomes, in terms of your findings, looking at these conflicts, are we seeing anything similar? Is there a broadness to it in which the likelihood of getting a positive result is improved?
That's a great question, and you've just given me the first line of my statistics course next semester. Thank you so much. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. There's a question, it's almost it sounds too good to be true. And so whenever you see this kind of situation, of course, it's very interesting then to look at the anomalies. So are there cases that do not follow this particular pattern, or does actually everything follow? Can you read into every conflict this same pattern? So what we found is quite interesting because a case, let me just take one of the outliers of conflicts, for example, Angola. Now, Angola, I remember when kind of growing up, you're always hearing about Angola, and it's almost like you get in the idea that maybe the conflict in Angola is somehow generic. No, that's actually quite a different conflict from the ones we saw. Now, it's almost like another debate. We'd have to have a few hours with experts on Angola to decide why that might be. It's not an easy reason to pick out why that might be, but it certainly tells us that Angola, whatever was happening in Angola, it's almost like an open question. Whatever was happening in Angola, it was not like all of these other conflicts that we're talking about. Also, if we take conventional conflicts, so when we looked at World War I and we looked at World War II, they also do not follow this same distribution. And that can be understood quite easily in the sense that those conflicts tended to be very conventional, two sides almost lining up at dawn, almost like the kind of old Hollywood view of two sides lining up at dawn and then hitting each other just throughout the whole day. That created much more of a kind of random behavior. And so that did not produce this pattern that we find. Also, when we looked at them one-sided behaviors, human behaviors, suicides, traffic accidents, etc., they also but completely different from this behavior. They do not follow this power law distribution. They do not have this C value of 2.5. So there really is actually something special about the conflicts, about the pattern in them. There's something in the way in which the two sides are adapting and counter-adapting that you didn't see in World War I and World War II, that you don't see in Angola. There's something about, and I'll call them insurgent conflicts, modern future conflicts, which is probably what a lot of future conflicts are going to be. There's something about this adaptation and counter-adaptation that not only makes them follow a common pattern, would make some of their properties predictable.
Now, do you imagine that this equation, this power law, is going to be the puzzle or just one of the pieces of a puzzle used in trying to figure out if a conflict is brewing and where it might go? Or are there just other things that the equation is not proper for? I know there might be sociologists out there who are going to be very frustrated saying, yeah, but for years I've been saying you got to look at climate because the temperature of an environment will make people more hostile, and that's the key thing, and this equation doesn't deal with that aspect.
You are absolutely right. You are absolutely right that there are, of course, 1,001 other variables. In fact, 1,001 will be underestimating it. There are many, many other variables, and this, when I say that the conflicts follow the 2.5, they do within a very, very small region of margin of error, very small margin of error. But what that tells us is quite interesting. It tells us that yes, maybe climate's important. Yes, poverty. Yes. History, yes, 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 to all these other variables. But there's something happens because they're kind of independent variables. They cancel out to some degree. And so when you're out on the field and you're fighting an insurgent conflict, what's dictating it and what's dictating the severity of the attacks is not the history, the climate, the poverty, it's the to and fro of these two sides as they play it out. And that is the generic feature.
Let's talk about pragmatics. We have this equation. We can plug it into most different scenarios and have a probable outcome. Does it give us the tools to say, well, if I change this variable, or if we get people to do this, it will change the correspondent behaviors? Does it give us that power?
It absolutely does, because what we do is not just crunch numbers and look for patterns in numbers. We also since I'm from the physical sciences, we try to build models of groups of people taking reasonably simple decisions and then acting collectively and seeing how they change in time. And then once we built a very, very simple model which reproduces this behavior. And now we can go into our little model as almost like our test tube insurgent conflict or our test tube cyber attacks, and we can change some of the features and see if they have the type of outcome that we would like in the evolution of the conflict. And I think that's really the power of the potential power of this type of work. It's not to say on Tuesday there will be this attack of this size, although you could make those kind of probabilistic statements. It's really to give a handle to people who have to make decisions, to give them it's like an extra little dial that they can tune to get a feel for the effect of some certain types of intervention. The last thing you want to do in any kind of confrontation is just the kind of suck it and see test. We'll try this, it didn't work. Well, actually, it may have worked, but maybe there were two other things that changed at the same time. And so having this kind of tool, I think, is really important for for planning.
Let's try to get a little bit concrete. Let me give you a scenario. Let's say that someone comes to you, a principal, and says, we are having rampant problems in bullying in our school, and I need to find a way to resolve it. What are some steps? What does your equation show me? What can we do to change the culture here?
That's a really interesting question, and it's one of those data sets that I would particularly like to study. But I have our work does show a kind of generic answer for that. It's quite interesting. If you want to, let's just say that one has to set a goal. So if the goal was to prevent the largest cases, so the most significant cases, so the biggest cases, say there's a bullying, you suspect there's some kind of bullying, there's some kind of coordination between bullying, and there's some kind of bullying ring in some sense. And this applies to all sorts of other activity, cyber activity, etc. There's some kind of grouping, some kind of dark network, which is producing the outcomes, the bullying that you do not want. And you want to break up those biggest clusters. They can be sometimes the hardest ones to break up because, of course, they're in some sense, they're the best protected. They know how to protect themselves. They know how to cover their tracks. What our work shows is that because the model that reproduces this 2.5 I was talking about is really the only way to reproduce that 2.5 is a model which assumes a kind of soup of groups, which is where clusters form and they occasionally combine or communicate with each other, or that's what I mean by combine, and they may fragment if they sense danger. By taking that mechanism, you see that what you need to do to break up the big rings is actually focus on the small rings, because those small rings feed in very quickly to those big rings. And so if you cannot attack the biggest little clique of bullies, and this applies online as well, go for the small ones, because they will be feeding in at some stage. If you can infiltrate them, they will eventually, and pretty quickly, they will tap into the largest network, and so you will get your influence in that largest network.
So a key to this philosophy, to this equation, is going from the micro to the macro and looking at the effects of the micro on the macro.
Absolutely.
So now that we solved school bullying, let's give you something, easier. How about if then someone from the UN comes to you and says, we're sick of the Syrian conflict. Let's stop it. Does your equation have any answers?
Again, if the goal is to prevent, so it's a very good question, but to answer, I mean, the interesting thing is the work we've done shows that you can answer that much more precisely. So if the goal is literally to stop it, that's one thing. But if the goal is to stop the largest events and just let it gradually peter out into small events that will eventually die over time, then actually the approach that I was just talking about, the breaking up of the larger ring, by focusing on the smaller rings, which will then feed into the larger ones. That's the way to go. If the goal is actually to reduce the frequency of events. So you've got lots of small events, and that's just not good. And you can deal with one occasional large one because you get the sense, let's imagine you may pick up on that through Facebook, say, or something like this. Then what you need to be doing is you need to be monitoring in the larger group the people that are leaving. And then once you do that, since they will leave and they will form small nuclei of other groups that will then do other things, they're the ones that will be controlling then the high frequency, small severity events.
Now, I would imagine that something like this would be good not only for dealing with ongoing conflicts, but that you could reverse engineer it as a preventative model. Because if you know what variables, what situations lead to conflict, or lead to elements building into a conflict, you might be able to try to remove those situations before they reach a boiling point. Have you worked on that? Have you looked at that?
Yes, part of our the research funding comes from the federal government, who are interested in how the kind of activity on the internet where Facebook is used, and it's associated with kind of civil protests. So imagine that there are some very damaging civil protests that are happening, and you don't want that to happen, or you'd like to kind of appease that group in some way. You need to kind of contact that group, etc. So one thing we're looking at particularly now is the how opinions begin to percolate across social media. So this is open social media. There's nothing closed about this. It's just the social media that you and I could sit and look at ourselves on the internet. There are opinions, I mean, just as there are opinions spread about, X Factor and all these kinds of things. Opinions spread, and you can begin to pick up what issues are really driving the crowd, and that is a way of maybe then appeasing the crowd before they develop into the kind of madness of crowds, which is something that you probably want to avoid.
So we started this interview with me joking about how this mathematical formula could be used to explain everything from child-parent struggles to cyber attacks and civil unrest, but that it might actually help us to finally understand women, or perhaps for women to finally understand men. It sounds like it might be able to do the former, but we still don't have an answer for the latter.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have answers to either of those. I think that may need a few more variables than the A, B, and the C.
Well, looking into a way to resolve conflicts on the micro to the macro level. I'm Andrew Hiller for The Prism, and I've been joined by Neil Johnson, who's a professor of physics and the head of the interdisciplinary research group in complexity at the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Miami. Thank you so much for your time and for working this out.
It was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.